This video is looking at comparison of approaches. So if you have a look at the front cover of your approaches booklet or a copy of the AQA specification, you'll see that comparison of approaches is its own dot point at the end of this topic, which means it is a subtopic in its own right, and it relies on you being able to have to draw upon strong knowledge of each of the approaches and to be able to compare them on a number of issues and debates. So each of the approaches differ from one another in their explanations of human behaviour and also on their stance on a number of different issues and debates. So some examples of these issues and debates, and you're going to be looking at these in greater detail next year when you actually look at the topic issues and debates. But for now, let's just go through a quick summary of what each of these means. So for the scientific methods for investigating behaviour, this is really asking, how does this approach study behaviour? Does it use lab experiments, animal studies, self-reports? Does it use case studies, etc.? And are these methods considered scientific? Are they objective? Are they completed under controlled conditions? Is it replicable? Is it testable? Is it falsifiable, etc.? Nature versus nurture, of course, this is looking at the relative contributions of genetic inheritance and environment in explaining human behaviour. So as you know, nature, of course, is concerned with hereditary factors like genes, and nurture, of course, is concerned with environmental factors. And each of the issues and debates will vary somewhere on this spectrum between nature and nurture. Likewise, reductionism and holism. So reductionist approaches believe that human behaviour can be explained by breaking it down into small constituent parts. This allows it to be studied easily under scientific conditions, but does mean that we lose some of the essence in describing behaviour. Whereas on the other hand, holistic approaches believe that human behaviour should be viewed as a whole integrated experience and not as separate parts. So this is the Gestalt principle. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Free will and determinism. Of course, determinism says that free will is an illusion and our behaviour is governed or at least controlled by internal or external forces over which we have no control. So there are different types of determinism. We could have genetic determinism, which says that our genes determine our behaviour. There's environmental as well. So this could be, ideas of parenting or conditions of worth. Whereas free will, on the other hand, says that we are playing an active role and we have choice over how we behave. So there might be influences on our behaviour, but ultimately we are free to choose our behaviour and we are self-determining. And then finally, the approaches to treating abnormal behaviour is looking at the ways that different approaches would explain and therefore treat mental illnesses and abnormal behaviour. So for instance, it could be negative self-schemas and faulty information processing, unresolved conflicts or abnormal neurochemistry, etc. And therefore this is going to affect how they actually treat abnormal behaviour, whether that's like CBT or drug therapy or psychoanalysis, for example. So you'll have a fairly good knowledge of each of these now because you completed this table in class. This is really your absolute Bible when it comes to AO3 for the approaches, not just for comparison of approaches, but because each of these boxes themselves can be turned into a really strong AO3 paragraph. So I really recommend, making this A3 and putting it up on your wall, and perhaps even making each of these into a little cue card that you can test yourself on. So on one side you have behaviorism and psychology as a science, and then on the other hand you've got a few dot points that can prompt you as to the ways that psychology is a science according to the behaviourist approach. And so I really, really would recommend consistently testing yourself on each of these boxes here. Alright, so why does this matter? Well, in addition to just getting a normal, straightforward outline and evaluate the cognitive approach in psychology essay, you could also be asked to write a 16-mark comparison of approaches essay. And this actually requires a little bit of a different structure to the one that you're used to. The layout is the same. You've still got 6 marks of AO1 and 10 marks of AO3, but the way that you're going to structure your AO3 paragraphs is going to be a little bit different. So some examples of these include explain one way in which social learning theory overlaps with one other approach in psychology. So you can see here that we've got reference to a second approach or one other approach. That indicates to you that this is a comparison essay. Outline key features of the cognitive approach. Compare the cognitive approach with the psychodynamic approach. It has been claimed that the humanistic approach has little to offer psychology. Outline and evaluate the humanistic approach in psychology. Refer to at least one other approach in your answer. So for any of these, and there's lots of other examples I'll show you shortly, for each of these types of essays, it does require you to structure your AO3 paragraphs differently so that you can actually compare and contrast the two approaches on particular issues and debates. So let's have a look at how you will structure these comparative evaluation paragraphs. So down here on the left-hand side, I've got the structure, then a little explanation, and then I'll talk you through an example of how this is applied to a quite simple comparative evaluation paragraph. So as always, you're going to have your point, and this is where you'll be signposting the issue or the debate that you'll be discussing. So for instance, in this case, the issue and debate is nature versus nurture. And again, it's just signposting to your examiner, these are the two approaches that I'm comparing and contrasting, and this is the issue or debate I'm contrasting them on. So behaviourism and the biological approach differ on their stance on the nature versus nurture debate, full stop. Very, very simple. Very straightforward. You just want to make it super clear to your examiner, these are the two approaches and this is the issue. Then you're going to provide an outline of this issue and debate for your first approach. So in this case, we're going to talk about behaviourism and where that lies on the nature versus nurture debate. Behaviourism believes we are born as a blank slate, tabula rasa, without any innate tendencies, and that all behaviour is learnt from our environment through the processes of classical and operant conditioning. So outlining there, sticking to nature versus nurture, and just providing a brief outline of where behaviourism lies on that debate. Then, because you're comparing and contrasting, you'll need to include some sort of comparative connective, like however, on the other hand, similarly, just to tie it together so that you're really staying focused. And then you're just going to do the same for your second approach. So this time we're outlining the biological approach's stance on nature versus nurture. The biological approach sits firmly on the nature side of the debate, arguing that behaviour can be explained in terms of heredity, biochemistry and biological structures, such as the brain and endocrine systems, and that the environment has little impact on our behaviour. So you can see why it's really important for you to memorise those boxes I showed you earlier in that table, because that will allow you to write these paragraphs in detail. Now, arguably the hardest part of writing an evaluation paragraph for a comparative essay is the link. And although it's possible for you to do it at this stage, these are going to get stronger once you've looked at issues and debates next year in a lot more detail. But definitely you need to start practicing that skill now. So the link is really important because you need to provide some sort of concluding statement. What does this mean for the approaches? Does it mean that there is one approach that is stronger than the other one? Does it mean that actually they've both got weaknesses and they're both flawed? Does it mean that actually they're both really scientific, they're both strong? What does this actually mean? And for some of the issues and debates, this is going to be much easier than for others. But you need to make some sort of stance at the end there. So in this case, we're actually saying that this is a limitation of both approaches because neither one considers the other stance. So, for example, it is now understood that human behaviour is the result of the complex interaction of both biological factors and the environment, and therefore neither the learning approaches nor the biological approach offer a complete explanation of human behaviour. So here we're really criticising both. There will be times where one approach will be stronger than the other, and you can say so and explain why. There will be times when actually both of them are equally as strong as the other. Sometimes you might not be able to say that one is stronger than the other, but you might just say that they complement each other. So for instance, if it is looking at behaviourism and let's say actually the cognitive approach and the biological approach and their treatment to abnormal behaviour, well, your link might be that both have successfully treated abnormal behaviour in the form of CBT and drug therapy, and actually sometimes an interactionist approach that uses both psychotherapy, CBT and drug therapy together leads to the most successful outcomes for patients. And so really this requires a little bit of thinking on your part to really evaluate and to weigh up and to compare and contrast which approach is stronger on a particular issue and debate. So that's the structure that I would like you to follow every time you're writing a comparison evaluation paragraph. Here's another example. This time it's looking at social learning theory and the cognitive approach. I've deliberately picked this one because it's one of the more tricky ones to evaluate on reductionism and holism. So, social learning theory and the cognitive approach differ in their views on reductionism, with the cognitive approach taking a much more reductionist view. So it's very clear here that we're talking about social learning theory and the cognitive approach, and we've outlined exactly what issue and debate we're going to be looking at as well. So that's our point, very, very clear. Now we outline our first approach. So the cognitive approach's use of the computer analogy has been criticised for its machine reductionism, as it explains behaviour in simple terms of input, processing and output, ignoring the role of human emotion and motivation in learning, which we know have a significant impact on our ability to process information. For example, in the case of anxiety affecting eyewitness testimony. Now we need our connective here, so in contrast, and now we're going to be outlining our second approach. Social learning theory recognises how cognitive factors, mediational processes such as retention, attention, etc., interact with the environment in the case of identification with a model and vicarious reinforcement. There's more that we could do there if we wanted to expand on that a little bit more, but that's fine. And then we provide our link, and this is where we're going to be weighing up whether one is stronger than the other. Therefore, the cognitive approach has a much more reductionistic view, as it believes human behaviour can be explained by breaking it down into smaller, simple component parts, whereas social learning theory takes into account more complex factors, including mental processes and the environment, and therefore arguably offers a more holistic explanation of human behaviour. So you can see that the structure is just going to be the same every single time. We've got our point outlining the first approach, our comparative connective, our second approach, and then our link there, which is providing some sort of conclusion as to which approach is stronger, or whether they're both strong or whether they're actually both limited, based on that issue and debate. So please, I want you to refer to this structure every single time you write a comparative evaluation paragraph. On Firefly, this week I've uploaded a model essay for social learning theory, so you can have a look at how an entire essay is written for this with this comparative structure. Alright, so let's have a look now at a couple of different ways you might be asked to plan a comparative essay. So our first question here, excuse me, outline key features of the cognitive approach in psychology. Compare the cognitive approach with the psychodynamic approach. You have to be very, very careful with the phrasing of comparative essays in the approaches section, because the examiners will be very, very clear with you what they want you to write for AO1 and what they would like you to write for AO3, and you must take heed of the question here. So AO1 is outline the key features of the cognitive approach in psychology. So really, we're paying attention to where this full stop is. I know that sounds silly, but this is going to help us. So we've got outline. We know that outline means AO1, the key features of the cognitive approach, full stop. So this means that, really straightforward, our AO1 is just going to be outlining 6 marks of the cognitive approach. So we're going to be talking about, of course, sort of schemas, the information processing model, the role of inference, etc. Now let's have a look at the second part. Compare the cognitive approach with the psychodynamic approach. So they've told you which approach they would like you to compare the cognitive approach to. So you unfortunately don't get a choice. Sometimes you do. We'll look at that in a second. In this case, it means all of your AO3 paragraphs need to be comparing and contrasting the cognitive approach with the psychodynamic approach. In this case, though, you get full reign, you get full choice over how you're going to compare them. So, for instance, you might like to write the first paragraph on how it treats abnormal behaviour. Your second paragraph might be on how scientific they are, looking at sort of looking at lab experiments versus case studies. And then your third paragraph again is just going to be comparing the cognitive approach with the psychodynamic approach, and this time it might be on reductionism. Again, you don't need an overall conclusion at all at the end of this essay. We don't need conclusions in psychology. We just need our AO1 for 6 marks outlining the cognitive approach, and then 3 AO3 paragraphs following that structure you just saw, comparing the cognitive approach with the psychodynamic approach on 3 different issues and debates. So that's one type of question you might get. Let's have a look at another type. So outline and evaluate social learning theory. In your answer, make comparisons with at least one other approach in psychology. Now, you've got some options here. So we can see again, outline and evaluate social learning theory. So we know that social learning theory is going to be our 6 marks of AO1. So we don't need to outline any other approach here. Make comparisons with at least one other approach in psychology. So this means that you've got some options. It means that you can follow the structure that we saw above. So you might want to pick just one other approach and write all 3 comparison evaluation paragraphs comparing social learning theory with that other approach. So you might write 3 paragraphs comparing social learning theory to the cognitive approach. Or what you might choose to do is for each paragraph compared to a different approach. If you do that, I think it's really important that you pick different issues and debates each time. So for instance, here we might like to compare social learning theory with the biological approach. And we might compare them on reductionism. In the next paragraph, we might like to compare social learning theory with, let's say, the humanistic. And we might compare them on determinism. And the next paragraph, social learning theory with the cognitive and on the scientific methods. What you don't want is to compare social learning theory with the biological approach on the stance of reductionism, and then compare social learning theory with the humanistic approach also on reductionism, and then compare social learning theory with the cognitive approach also on reductionism. There's going to be a very, very repetitive essay, and it will just mean that your initial outline of the approach will be the exact same in all 3 paragraphs, and that's just going to be a really messy and weak essay. So make sure that you're comparing on different issues and debates for each approach. I think, to be honest, the easiest way is just to pick the one approach all the way through, but you might not feel that strongly, and you might want some variety. This is where you are able to decide what's best for you. And now the final type of essay that you get, outline and evaluate the behaviourist approach and the biological approach. So outline the behaviourist approach and the biological approach. Outline is obviously 6 marks of AO1. In this case, we have to outline both. So we're going to be outlining behaviourism, and this is going to be about 3 marks. And then, of course, we've got the biological approach, which we need to provide an outline of, so that's also going to be 3 marks. So this one is just going to be 1 short paragraph on behaviourism and 1 short paragraph on the biological approach. But it's really important here that we do provide AO1 and an outline of each of those. And then compare and contrast each approach. This indicates to us our AO3, and we know that for each of these AO3 paragraphs, we're having to compare the behaviourist approach and the biological approach. But you are able to choose which issues and debates you want to compare and contrast them on. So, for instance, paragraph 1, behaviourism versus the biological approach on nature versus nurture. Second paragraph, behaviourism versus biological approach on treatment of abnormal behaviour. And then our final paragraph could be on, for instance, scientific methods. So you just pick the 3 issues and debates that you're most confident with for each of those 2 approaches. So you can see here we've got 3 very different structures for 3 very different questions. It's absolutely essential that you read really, really carefully so that you know whether the question is asking you to just outline one approach or outline both approaches, and also to see which approach they would like you to compare your original one to, or whether you get the choice. So here are a few examples of different past essay questions for the approaches comparison essays. So I do recommend that you have a go at a few of these, or at least have a go at planning them so you can see how your AO1 and AO3 might differ for each question. Try these under timed conditions. Start off perhaps by having that table, the summary table of approaches next to you, and then eventually start working your way away from that so you're able to do it independently without your notes and under timed conditions.